In the winter of 1299, 60,000 Mongol horsemen rode toward the gates of Delhi with a single objective: total conquest. They had spent 6 months marching across Central Asia and the Punjab, conserving their strength, avoiding unnecessary battles, preparing for the moment when they would claim the jewel of India as their own. The Mongols had destroyed empires from China to Eastern Europe. They had sacked Baghdad and slaughtered 1 million people in a week. They had trampled the Abbasid Caliphate into dust and turned the greatest cities of Islam into smoking ruins. Now they stood at the doorstep of Delhi, led by a prince who carried the blood of Genghis Khan himself, commanding an army that had never known permanent defeat. But waiting for them inside those walls was a sultan who had murdered his way to the throne, a man so ruthless that his own generals feared him more than they feared the Mongol horde. What happened in the fields of Kili over 3 frozen December days would shatter Mongol dreams of conquest and prove that even the most terrifying army in history could be broken by a leader willing to sacrifice everything. Alauddin Khalji was not born to rule Delhi. He had seized the throne 3 years earlier by assassinating his own uncle, Sultan Jalaluddin, during a hunting trip. Alauddin had embraced the old man, then nodded to his accomplices who stabbed Jalaluddin to death while Alauddin held him. It was calculated, cold-blooded murder, driven by pure ambition. The assassination made Alauddin one of the most hated rulers in Delhi, but it also demonstrated a quality that would prove essential when facing the Mongols. Alauddin was willing to do absolutely anything to win. He trusted no one, showed mercy to no one, and ruled through a combination of fear and brutal efficiency. His generals knew that disobedience meant death. His people knew that resistance meant destruction. When the Mongol threat emerged, Delhi had exactly the kind of leader it needed, a man as merciless as the enemy at the gates. The Mongol commander was Qutlugh Khwaja, son of Delhi Khan, who ruled the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Qutlugh was young, ambitious, and carrying the weight of immense expectations. His father had sent him to India with clear instructions: conquer Delhi and establish permanent Mongol rule over northern India. This wasn't a raid for plunder or a punitive expedition. This was full-scale invasion with the goal of erasing the Delhi Sultanate from the map. The Mongols commanded 60,000 of the finest cavalry in the world, warriors who had been raised in the saddle, who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, who had perfected the art of the feigned retreat and the devastating flank attack. These men had destroyed armies twice their size. They had broken the will of emperors and scattered the forces of caliphs. They believed in their own invincibility because they had never been given reason to doubt it. The Mongol march through the Punjab was a masterpiece of strategic patience. They bypassed fortified cities, avoided confrontations with local garrisons, and moved steadily toward Delhi without wasting men or resources. When Alauddin's frontier generals tried to harass them at night, the Mongols ignored the provocations and kept moving. When Zafar Khan, one of Alauddin's most aggressive commanders, sent messengers challenging Qutlugh to battle, the Mongol prince refused with aristocratic disdain. He declared that kings only fight kings, and that Zafar should come to Delhi and fight under his master's banner if he wanted combat. This arrogance would prove costly, but at the time it seemed justified. The Mongols had crushed everyone who stood against them. Why should a sultanate ruled by an upstart murderer be any different? The news of the Mongol approach created panic in Delhi. Refugees from the surrounding countryside flooded into the city, filling the streets and mosques with terrified families, carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. Merchant caravans stopped coming to the capital, strangled by Mongol cavalry that controlled the roads. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed as supply chains collapsed. The psychological warfare was already working. Before a single arrow had been fired, Delhi was gripped by fear. Alauddin's advisors begged him to negotiate, to offer tribute, to do anything except face the Mongol army in open battle. His own uncle and the governor of Delhi, al-Mulk, pleaded with him to use diplomacy instead of warfare. The odds seemed impossible. Intelligence reports estimated the Mongol force at numbers that far exceeded what Alauddin could quickly assemble. A frontal battle looked like suicide. Alauddin rejected every counsel of caution with cold logic that revealed his understanding of power. He told his advisors that if he showed weakness now, if he negotiated or paid tribute, he would lose the respect of his army and his people. Future rebellions would cite his cowardice. The Mongols would return again and again, each time demanding more. The only path to survival was victory, no matter how unlikely. Alauddin assembled whatever forces he could gather on short notice. Reinforcements from distant provinces wouldn't arrive in time, so he worked with what he had in and around Delhi. The army that marched to Kili included both cavalry and infantry, backed by war elephants that served as mobile fortresses and psychological weapons. The elephants were positioned at the front of each division, 22 massive beasts that could trample cavalry and terrify horses. Alauddin issued strict orders that no commander was to move from his assigned position without explicit permission. The penalty for disobedience would be immediate execution. This was not negotiable. Alauddin knew that fighting the Mongols required absolute discipline. One unit breaking formation could collapse the entire army. The battlefield at Kili was bounded by the Yamuna River on one side and bushland on the other, terrain that limited the room for the sweeping cavalry maneuvers that were the Mongol specialty. Alauddin positioned his forces carefully, using the geography to constrain Mongol mobility while maintaining his own defensive integrity. He wanted to delay the battle as long as possible, hoping that supply problems would force the Mongols to retreat without fighting. The Mongols had traveled far from their supply bases. Winter was setting in. Every day that passed without battle weakened the invaders while Alauddin's position strengthened. It was sound strategy, but it required patience and discipline from an army that knew 60,000 enemies were camped just miles away. Zafar Khan, the general who had earlier challenged Qutlugh to personal combat, made a decision that would cost him his life and nearly cost Alauddin the battle. Without permission, without coordination with the rest of the army, Zafar led his division in a direct charge against the Mongol position. Initially, the attack succeeded. Zafar's cavalry smashed into the Mongol formation and drove them back. For a brief moment, it looked like a glorious victory. Then the Mongols demonstrated why they had conquered half the world. The retreat was a feint, a classic Mongol tactic. As Zafar pursued, the Mongols wheeled around him, encircling his division and cutting him off from the main army. Alauddin watched from his position as Zafar's forces were surrounded and systematically destroyed. He had the strength to intervene, to send reinforcements that might have saved Zafar. He chose not to. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was cold calculation. Zafar had disobeyed orders. If Alauddin rewarded that disobedience by coming to his rescue, it would undermine the entire command structure. Every other general would think they could ignore orders and expect to be bailed out. So Alauddin held his position and let Zafar die. The Mongols gave Zafar a chance to surrender. He refused and fought until he was cut down. Before he died, his division managed to inflict heavy casualties on the Mongol forces, killing hundreds of warriors and wounding many more, including several high-ranking officers. The death of Zafar Khan created a crisis for both armies. The Delhi forces were demoralized by the loss of one of their best generals and the annihilation of an entire division. The Mongols had won the engagement, but paid a terrible price in casualties. More critically, Qutlugh Khwaja himself had been wounded during the fighting, struck by a blade or projectile that left him unable to command effectively. The injury wasn't immediately fatal, but it was serious enough to hobble Qutlugh's ability to lead. That night, as both armies regrouped, Alauddin's officers urged him to retreat to Delhi and fight from behind the city's fortifications. They argued that Zafar's defeat proved the Mongols were unbeatable in open battle. They pleaded with Alauddin to save what remained of his army. Alauddin's response was characteristic. He told his officers that Zafar had suffered because of his own disobedience, not because of Mongol superiority. He declared that if he moved at all, he would only move forward, never back. The message was clear: deserters would be hunted down and executed. Cowards would be killed. The only path was through the Mongols. This wasn't inspiring leadership in the traditional sense. It was leadership through terror, through the absolute certainty that the Sultan was more dangerous to his own men than the enemy. It worked. The Delhi army held its position, battered but unbroken, waiting for the Mongols to make the next move. But the Mongols didn't move. Qutlugh Khwaja, wounded and in pain, hesitated to order a general assault. The casualties from Zafar Khan's division had been higher than expected. The Delhi army was larger than anticipated and better positioned than intelligence had suggested. Most importantly, Qutlugh was learning that this enemy was different from the others the Mongols had faced. The Delhi forces hadn't panicked when Zafar's division was destroyed. They hadn't broken and fled. They had held their ground with a discipline that suggested they would be costly to defeat. For an army that had traveled 6 months and thousands of miles to fight this battle, the prospect of a Pyrrhic victory was deeply troubling. The second day at Kili passed without major combat. Both armies watched each other across the field, neither willing to commit to an assault. Alauddin maintained his rigid defensive formation, while Qutlugh wrestled with his injury and the growing realization that this campaign wasn't going according to plan. The Mongol prince sent scouts to assess the Delhi positions and probe for weaknesses. They found none. Alauddin had positioned his forces expertly, using the terrain to neutralize Mongol mobility advantages. The war elephants stood at the front like living walls, protecting the infantry and cavalry behind them. Any Mongol charge would have to break through those elephants first, and Mongol horses were terrified of the massive beasts. On the third day, Qutlugh Khwaja made his decision. The Mongols would retreat. This wasn't a rout or a panic. It was a calculated withdrawal by a commander who recognized that the costs of victory would exceed the benefits. Qutlugh's wound was worsening. The Delhi army showed no signs of breaking. Supply lines were stretched to their limit. Winter was deepening. Most critically, the element of surprise and psychological dominance that the Mongols relied on had been lost. The Delhi forces had seen Mongol warriors bleed and die. They had held their ground against the legendary horsemen of the steppes. Whatever happened in a future battle, the myth of Mongol invincibility in India had been shattered. That night, the Mongol army broke camp and began the long march back to Central Asia. Alauddin watched them go without pursuit. He had achieved his objective without a climactic battle. The Mongols had come to conquer Delhi and had been turned back without even breaching the city's outer defenses. In the brutal arithmetic of medieval warfare, this counted as a decisive victory. Alauddin returned to Delhi not as a defeated sultan begging for terms, but as a triumphant defender who had faced down the Mongol horde. The psychological impact was immense. Delhi erupted in celebration. Alauddin's legitimacy, always questionable because of how he had seized power, was suddenly unassailable. He was the Sultan who had protected India from the Mongols, the man who had done what no one else could do. The cost of the victory was also clear. Zafar Khan, one of Alauddin's most capable generals, was dead along with his entire division. Thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded. The treasury had been strained to equip and supply the army. Alauddin's response to Zafar's death was telling. He refused to allow any praise of the dead general's courage. Instead, he denounced Zafar's recklessness and disobedience in the royal court. This seemed heartless, but it served a purpose. Alauddin was sending a message that no amount of bravery or success in battle would excuse violation of his orders. Discipline mattered more than heroism. Obedience mattered more than glory. It was a harsh lesson, but one that would keep his army effective in future campaigns. For Qutlugh Khwaja, the retreat became a death march. His wound became infected, and he died somewhere on the road back to Central Asia. His body was carried home in disgrace, the prince who had promised to conquer India but had barely reached Delhi before being forced to withdraw. His death deprived the Mongols of a potentially great commander and dealt a psychological blow to the Chagatai Khanate. Dua Khan had sent his son to extend Mongol dominion and received back a corpse and a defeated army. The message was clear: India would not fall as easily as Baghdad or Bukhara. The Delhi Sultanate had defenses and a sultan willing to use them without mercy. The Battle of Kili didn't end Mongol attempts to invade India, but it fundamentally changed the dynamic. The Mongols attacked again in 1303, laying siege to Delhi itself, but Alauddin held them off behind fortified walls. They invaded in 1305 and were defeated at the Battle of Amroha. They tried again in 1306 and were repulsed at the Ravi River. Each successive invasion was less ambitious than the last. Each retreat was more definitive. The Mongols were learning that India was a graveyard for Mongol ambitions, a place where their tactical advantages evaporated against prepared defenses and determined resistance. By the time Alauddin died in 1916, the Mongol threat to India had been permanently contained. The secret to Alauddin's success wasn't superior tactics or revolutionary weapons. It was his absolute ruthlessness and his understanding that fighting the Mongols required matching their brutality with equal or greater severity. Alauddin ruled through fear, and that fear translated into an army that would rather face Mongol arrows than their sultan's wrath. When other rulers tried diplomacy or paid tribute, Alauddin chose confrontation. When his generals disobeyed, he let them die as object lessons. When advisors counseled retreat, he threatened to advance. This wasn't the leadership of a hero or a saint. It was the leadership of a tyrant who understood that survival required being more terrifying than the enemy. The aftermath of Kili rippled through the Islamic world. News spread that the Mongols had been turned back from Delhi, that the Sultanate had held against an invasion force that would have overwhelmed most kingdoms. It provided hope to other Muslim rulers facing Mongol pressure and demonstrated that the horsemen from the steppes could be defeated with proper preparation and leadership. The victory also secured Alauddin's domestic position, allowing him to implement sweeping administrative and military reforms that would strengthen the Delhi Sultanate for decades. He created a standing army, reformed the tax system, and established intelligence networks that gave him early warning of threats. These reforms were brutal and often unjust, but they made Delhi nearly impregnable. The human cost of defending India from the Mongols is difficult to calculate, but certainly immense. Thousands died in the battles at Kili, Amroha, and the siege of Delhi. Countless more died in the frontier raids and skirmishes that continued for years. Alauddin's reforms required heavy taxation that impoverished many of the subjects. His paranoia led to purges and executions that eliminated potential rivals, but also killed innocent people. He was not a good man by any moral standard, but he achieved something that eluded many better men. He protected India from the Mongol invasions and preserved Islamic civilization in the subcontinent at its most vulnerable moment. The Battle of Kili stands as a testament to the power of will over circumstance. Alauddin was outnumbered, facing an enemy with superior cavalry and battlefield experience. He had limited time to prepare, and an army that included a general who would rather seek glory than follow orders. By every rational calculation, he should have lost. But Alauddin refused to accept defeat as inevitable. He positioned his forces intelligently, maintained iron discipline, and waited for the Mongols to blink first. When they did, when Qutlugh Khwaja chose retreat over a costly victory, Alauddin had won without fighting the climactic battle everyone expected. It was an anticlimactic ending to a confrontation that could have changed the course of Indian history. In the frozen fields of Kili in December 1299, two visions of empire collided. The Mongols represented conquest through overwhelming force and mobility, the subjugation of settled civilizations by nomadic warriors who made warfare their entire culture. Alauddin represented the defense of civilization through any means necessary, even when those means themselves were brutal and unjust. Neither side could claim moral superiority. Both were willing to kill without mercy to achieve their objectives. But in that specific time and place, Alauddin's ruthless determination proved more effective than Mongol confidence. The Sultan who had murdered his way to power became the Sultan who saved Delhi from the Mongols. History doesn't always reward the righteous, but it does remember those who refuse to surrender when surrender seems inevitable. The strategic implications of Kili extended far beyond one battlefield. The Mongols had operated under the assumption that terror and reputation could win battles before they began. When cities heard the Mongols were coming, they often surrendered immediately to avoid the massacres that resistance brought. This psychological warfare was as important as the Mongol cavalry tactics. By standing his ground and forcing the Mongols to retreat, Alauddin broke that psychological advantage. Future opponents of the Mongols would cite Kili as proof that the horsemen could be stopped. The aura of inevitability that surrounded Mongol conquests had been damaged, perhaps permanently. The tactical lessons from Kili were studied by military commanders for generations. Alauddin demonstrated that Mongol mobility could be countered by selecting defensive terrain that limited their room to maneuver. The war elephants proved effective as psychological weapons that terrified Mongol horses and created barriers that cavalry couldn't easily bypass. The strict discipline Alauddin enforced showed the importance of command structure when facing an enemy that specialized in exploiting disorder and panic. These weren't revolutionary insights, but their successful application against the Mongols validated them in ways that theoretical discussions never could. The personality of Alauddin Khalji emerges from the Battle of Kili as a complex mixture of strategic brilliance and moral bankruptcy. He was a man who could calculate battlefield positions with precision while watching his own general die without lifting a hand to help. He inspired loyalty through terror rather than affection, maintained power through brutality rather than justice, and achieved victory through absolute ruthlessness rather than heroic courage. He was not someone to admire, but he was someone who understood what needed to be done and did it without hesitation. In the specific context of defending Delhi from the Mongols, those qualities made him exactly the right leader at the right time. The contrast between Alauddin and Qutlugh Khwaja illuminates different approaches to command. Qutlugh Khwaja led with confidence born from aristocratic lineage and previous Mongol successes. He expected enemies to crumble before Mongol power because they always had before. When faced with an opponent who refused to follow the script, who wouldn't be intimidated or outmaneuvered, Qutlugh Khwaja hesitated. His wound provided a convenient excuse for retreat, but the underlying cause was deeper. He had encountered something the Mongols rarely faced, an enemy who matched their ruthlessness and exceeded their determination. The legacy of the Battle of Kili resonates through centuries. The Mongol Empire never recovered its momentum in India. The Delhi Sultanate survived to rule northern India for another 2 centuries. The cultural landscape of South Asia developed along trajectories that Mongol conquest would have altered irrevocably, all because one ruthless sultan chose to stand and fight when everyone advised him to run. The fields of Kili witnessed the collision of 2 empires, and the outcome determined the fate of millions.